Good evening, everybody, and welcome to webinar number 62, Ethics and Critical Reflection. Tonight we have a special guest, Anne-Marie Hayes, but while we're just filling the room up, imagine me as the person holding the door open. I'm going to ask you where in the world you are, what kind of social work are you practicing or are you interested in? And as we always have a different question each week, I want to know, what was it that attracted you to social work? So a few of us are going to keep an eye on the chat. So if your chat's working, that's fantastic. Tell us in the chat where in the world you are, what area of social work are you studying or are you interested in, and what was it initially that attracted you to social work? And just as a reminder, when you type in the chat, make sure your settings say everyone so we can all join in the webinar chat together.
So it's so good that Chris has managed to get back to us, and we all just want to say many nominated for the Social Worker of the Year Awards, for newly qualified social worker, I think it was, Chris, and you got the Silver Award in those National Social Worker of the Year Awards. So well done to Chris, and thank you for immediately after hearing that, you then drove back to open the webinar for us tonight. So thank you very much for that. Now, every now and again, somebody contacts the team and says, I'd really like to do a webinar for you. I'd really like to do a session. And then we can all sit back and learn. And so I love these sessions. Look, there's my notepad, blank piece of paper that I can put some notes down on in terms of what I've learned from tonight. And we're going to be led through tonight by Anne-Marie, who is going to talk us through thinking about not just ethics, but how ethics and critical reflection might be connected and may come together. And I think there's going to be a lot of learning in this for us. I think actually there's going to be a lot of us asking ourselves questions and maybe coming out of the end of the session with lots more questions. And that's a real learning experience for everybody, I think. So I'm not going to take up any more time because I know there's so much for us to get through. And I'm just going to hand over to Anne-Marie and say thank you very much for taking us through tonight, Anne-Marie. And it's over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you to the team for hosting me or allowing me to be involved with this amazing resource, sharing knowledge and skills. It's really important that we share as practitioners what we have experienced and learned with those that are coming through. So I offered to do a session tonight because I'm currently studying at Leeds Trinity University, and I'm looking at critical reflection and asking whether it should be considered a contemporary social work virtue. Hence my interest in ethics and social work and critical reflection, because I think they are connected much more fundamentally than we express in our practice and in our learning. And I think very often what we do is we learn the theory around what it means to be ethical or what ethics are, perhaps, and then we discard that knowledge and we get on with our practice. It's hard to keep in contact with what it means to be an ethical practitioner. So this is pretty much a whistle-stop tour into ethics, some of the concepts that we use when we talk about or think about ethics, and some of the ideas around critical reflection. And I know you've done other sessions or other webinars on reflection, reflective practice, so probably won't repeat too much of it tonight because you can go there to access that information. But yeah, I hope it will join some of the dots up and also create some outliers for you to go and find where the connections are for you, because they may be different. So that's my hope anyway. Right, so if you can put the first slide on, Siobhan, it's just saying, that essentially what I'm trying to do tonight is make some of those connections between ethics, social work and critical reflection, because we can look up each of those subjects in isolation. But what I'm hoping that you'll start to do with me is make some connections that make that make them more useful to each other, that make those relationships more useful, so that we don't do social work and then in supervision think about what the ethics are or how we might use critical reflection, but that they're all working together at the same time. Okay, thank you. Now, Kelly asked you a question at the start of the session tonight, but what made you want to become a social worker? And the reason I asked that question is because we generally have some quite strong or firmly held ideas about what attracts us to social work. And if we move on to the next slide, if we get as far as getting into social work training or actually becoming qualifying as social workers, it feels like we're on a mission impossible sometimes, or mission possible. And the mission is usually made up of these kinds of activities around enhancing human well-being and meeting the needs of people in all their complexity, across all the ages and genders and all the intersectionalities, working with people in their environments, in their contexts, and helping them to cope, helping to facilitate change. I mean, most people could probably come up with a list of definitions as to why social work is a useful profession. But lying underneath all of these aims and goals, or this mission statement for social workers, there has to be something that holds it together so that we don't just do things to people or for them. And social work as a profession in the UK is sort of about 130, 140 years old, isn't it? Something like that. And it started out with the benevolence of rich people, really, wasn't it? Doing good to those who deserved good to be done to them. We've moved on from that, where we don't talk so much about the deserving poor, although sometimes it feels as if we do work with people as if they are in deserving categories. But we've moved away from that, and one of the things that's helped us to do that is by developing an ethical position or an ethical basis to our work. And I think when we talk about doctors or the medical profession, we're all very easily able to say that to be a medical professional, you will generally say, I will do no harm or do least harm. But I think it's a lot harder to quantify that statement for social workers. What does it mean to be an ethical social worker? And we can talk about some of the ideas about, we might even say do no harm as well, but what does that actually mean in practice? So if you move on to the next slide, Joanne, please. I know you'll probably all have seen this already, the global definition of social work. And what's interesting about this definition is that it was the sum of 140 odd countries coming together and deciding what would be a good way of defining what social work is or looks like in all of those contexts, in all of those cultural, religious, ethnic, racial contexts, and that we're able to come up with one definition that provides an umbrella for all of us to fit into somehow and guide our practice. And what's interesting about this definition for me is that it talks about principles, but it doesn't say social work is an ethical profession specifically, but it does say we use principles of social justice and human rights. And those two concepts feature a lot in all the talk about what it means to be a social worker, but also what it means to be ethical, human rights and social justice. So if we get nothing else but that, holding those ideas in mind as practitioners, we're probably going to be okay. So the International Federation of Social Workers also devised a statement of ethical principles. And again, it's like the principles is they've got 9 principles. One of them specifically refers to an ethical use of technology and social media, which links to your session that you've had recently, or your conversations recently. But these principles state that social work stems from an ethical position, so that there is an ethical underpinning to the work that we do. But do we know what that is? And I think for me, that's why this session might be important to people to think about. Go on to the next slide, please, Siobhan. If we have the international definition, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, that the British Association of Social Workers is the umbrella body that oversees practice and training and guidance and advises social workers in the UK. So that's Northern Ireland. So we've got people here from Belfast and Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland and England are all covered by this BASWA Code of Ethics. And the Code of Ethics offers the values and ethical principles on which our profession is based in the UK. So I'm just really interested when I've gone around to different offices and asked people, have you actually seen a copy of the Code of Ethics? Often when you're in your student social work, when you're studying and you're at university, or even in your placements, you might see them. But when you start in practice, does your place of work actually have a Code of Ethics that's accessible, that you can see and refer to throughout your day, throughout your week? I mean, my experience, it isn't. It's gone. You've studied it, you've learned about it, and then it's gone. Or you've even done a module on ethics, and then it's, well, we've covered that. Somehow it's become part of our being as social workers, as student social workers. We don't need it anymore. But I actually talked to a manager, and she said, you know, this is really important. And she decided she's going to pin it to her wall in her office. And when sticky situations came up in supervision, or when social workers came with dilemmas, first thing she would do, which was a conversation we had, I said, why not take that down when you don't know which way to go? Think about which ethical position or which ethical value or principle you are responding to in trying to answer that question. Yeah, that might be something to do. So something to bear in mind. I don't know how many people have said they have access to Code of Ethics. Have people said they do? They have seen it, Dave? Do they have contact with it? Or
Sorry, people are saying yeah, and Keela is saying like classes, they class it as their go-to documents in a separate folder. And I was just saying like I think I've only just seen this year, to be honest. And I'm third year, so I should have seen it by now. But yeah, it's important. Some people say not for them, but other people saying yeah. So.
Yeah. I don't think it's unusual not to have seen it, and I think that's one of the things that we should take away, is that we should have it as our, you know, our little pocket guide to how we act as social workers, how we think, act, and feel social workers. It's sort of ethics would underpin all of that. So, okay, that was an interesting question to ask. So, next slide, please. Sounds like a game show, doesn't it? Yeah. I thought if I'm going to refer you to the Code of Ethics, the BASW Code of Ethics, then it would be useful to actually show you what BASW says about the Code of Ethics. And they do mention ethics, and they do talk about values. And I don't think it'll be a surprise to anybody. I'm just going to get rid of my screen so I can see my screen. That's about human rights again, social justice appears again, humanitarian and democratic ideals. So values are set up as being key to how we think about ethics. And the values that are mentioned in this definition are respect for equality, worth, and dignity of all people. So some of you, in thinking about why you became social workers, these kinds of ideas probably underpinned that thinking to why you wanted to get into social work. So I'm just trying to change my screen. Sorry, next screen, Siobhan, sorry. So if we're fundamentally driven by human rights and social justice, you can see why we do some of the things that we do and why we work with particular communities in the way that we do. I actually drew out the values and the ethical principles that are listed in BASW Code of Ethics, and they actually list, there's 3 values that they list, and underneath each value they list a set of principles. So the first one is human rights, and they have got 5 principles underneath that. I don't think we need to necessarily go through it, do we? We can show the next slide. Social justice, again, so human rights, social justice, you have the value, and then underneath it the principles informing it. And the next one being professional integrity, I think, if I'm right. Yeah, so they've defined human rights, social justice, and professional integrity as the values that we should all hold as ethical social workers in the UK, and that the principles that inform those values are listed in that Code of Ethics. But what's interesting is that, again, you have values mentioned, principles mentioned, But unless you've thought about what a value is and what a principle is, do these definitions make any sense when you read them? I think we can assume that we know what a value is, and we can assume that we all know what a principle is, until I actually ask the question. If I was to ask you all to put in the comments, what is a value, what is a principle, and what is ethics, we will probably come up with some variations on what those things are. And it's a bit like reflection, the terms of reflection, reflexivity, reflective practice, and critical reflection. There is a lot of conflation goes on with the ideas related to ethics. We talk about ethics and morals as if they're the same thing. We talk about principles and values as if they're the same thing. And sometimes even standards and values and beliefs all get conflated, as if we all have a common language, and somehow it doesn't really matter how we use those words because we all understand what we mean by them. And that's why I thought this session might be useful, to just try and pick apart some of those ideas, and so we can put them back together again at the end somehow. So if we can do the next slide, please, Joanne. So the Basel Code of Ethics tells you what ethics are, tells you what the principal values that it expects you to hold are: the social justice, human rights, professional integrity. But then at the end of it, it gives you some definitions. And I don't know whether, for me, it would be more useful to have seen that at the start of the Code of Ethics, but that might just be me because I can be quite pedantic about things. But they give you definitions of ethics, ethics being about matters of right and wrong conduct, good and bad qualities of character, and responsibilities attached to relationships. So there's nothing complicated there, nothing complex. It's useful to think about ethics as not being just about how we relate to other people, but that it also includes how we relate to the rest of the planet that we live on. And in this time of thinking about climate change and the COP26 conferences that have just concluded, thinking about how animals flourish and all the ecosystems around the world, ethics determine how we relate to them and how we treat them and how we do good or not so good in relation to the world around us. Ethics is often defined as a philosophy, a way of studying morals and qualities. So I'm not looking at the chat, it's popping up. And professional ethics, which this Code of Ethics, the Basel Code of Ethics, refers to, is specifically about right and wrong conduct, good and bad qualities of character within a professional context. So about how we conduct our work as social workers. Are there any questions that are coming in that I need to respond to in this moment, Dave, or is it?
Only question from me, and you can answer it whenever you want. And it said, do you think individual culture impacts upon ethics? Like I say, answer it, don't answer it, the chat can answer it. I just felt like asking. So.
It's a really good question to ask, and I think there are as many answers, well, maybe not as many, but there are different answers, and some people will say very definitely culture does influence ethical position. Yes, it does. My response would be yes, it does.
Yeah, that's a good, clear answer. Thank you. Yeah.
Because if we were to look at, in looking at the 140 odd countries that came together to develop the global definition of social work, I think most of them have got codes of ethics. I think Yemen has come out as the only country that hasn't actually yet developed its own code of ethics. Now well, if you think about what's happening in Yemen right now, that makes sense, doesn't it? It's in such a state of chaos and flux and conflict that how might it be possible to easily create the code of ethics? So culture and context, definitely. If you think about, I mean, the example that's often given is think about Nazi Germany. If you think about their code of ethics as a government, their ethical values, we definitely don't hold on to them now. Or I'm sure most people would say that that's not a useful set of values and ethics to hold on to. So yeah, they do change over time and context, so, if that's helpful. So yeah, so again, Braswell gives a working definition of values and social work values. And its definition of values is about, this definition of values talks about referring to moral, cultural, political, or ideological. So that answers your question there about, talks about it in relation to values. But then it talks about beliefs, principles, attitudes, opinions. Now, for me, that's values is defined by a set of other words that are not defined. Does that make sense to you? It feels like values is just that, oh, values is made up of all of these things, but we're not going to tell you what these things are, because you should know what values are, because we've been telling you all along that values are about, or we've been telling you that values are about right and or good and bad, right and wrong conduct or good or bad behaviours and attitudes. But underpinning the value, or what informs the value, is beliefs, principles, attitudes and opinions. Okay, so where do we get those from? Or how do we know what it means to have a belief or an opinion or an attitude? So the social work values are those beliefs, principles, attitudes, opinions that make you a good social worker, or do your social work tasks in a right or good way. Again, so it talks about beliefs here. It's a big clue that all the way through this presentation, I have just highlighted every time the word ethics appears, every time the word values, principles, opinions, because those are the words that fundamentally tell you what values and ethics are and how they relate to critical reflection. So the clue was starting to drip through all the way. So what beliefs, ideas that people hold about what is regarded as worthy or valuable. But actually, you've told us that values are things that are important or valuable. So how can that be a belief as well? Are they the same thing? Are we using the same words? Are we confusing ourselves? And I'm not sure that, for me, I don't find this definition very helpful. And if I was a student social worker, or even a newly qualified student social worker, or even now, I'd still be asking, what does this actually mean as a statement? Social work values can be regarded as particular types of beliefs. But what's a belief? Because at the end it says belief reflects the status that values have as stronger than mere opinions or preferences. All right, so we're saying that there's a hierarchy. Beliefs reflect the status of values, but they're more important than opinions. Well, then what's an opinion? And how does an opinion inform a belief or a value? And how does that lead into ethics? You see how we have this conundrum, this craziness of what does it for me? They do give you some more definitions in the Braswell Code of Ethics. Principles are essential norms in a system of thought or belief. Right, so it's saying about informing the basis of reasoning in the system. So for me, principles are fundamental ideas and building blocks. They underpin, I keep using that word, underpin, but they really inform everything else. Principles tend to be quite static. They tend to be, there's a universality to them that we can all recognize principles from around the world. We might not all agree with or recognize the same ethics or the same values, but principles tend to be much more universal and fixed and don't change as much. So when the Code of Ethics, the Braswell Code of Ethics, lists a value first and then lists principles underneath it, for me, that feels like it's the wrong way around. It's that the principles set the values. But I guess it's just another way of looking at it. But it's important to think about which way round we're thinking about values, beliefs, principles and ethics, how they all fit together in this jigsaw. The ethics, in the Code of Ethics, principles are divided into two kinds. You've got the ethical principles, so as it says there, general statements, so underpinning the work, relating to attitudes, but then also the principles of professional practice, and how to achieve, so how to do the social work job. So one's about, you know, all the thoughts and feelings you might have, but the others about how you then do something with those ideas. So one's about the doing, one's about all the things that inform doing. And then the standards, so suddenly we've now got standards just introduced. Okay, what are the standards? Where have they come from? I'm not sure. We've just got standards, ethical standards, but they're rules. But some people would say that actually ethics are a set of rules determining how you actually behave in a way that leads to good conduct rather than wrong conduct, or right behavior, right conduct, so that they implicitly are rules, that they don't actually, you don't actually have to call them standards or rules, that ethics actually create rules. But because they can inform right or wrong, maybe some people felt that there's a need to make a distinction. But again, it's another word, standards. What is a standard? So you have your professional standards, your ethical standards in the code of ethics. And I think it's all very messy. And I think for me, it's not always clear what it means to be ethical. Like when you've got this far, do you think that you know what it means to be an ethical social worker? I just want, you can put the next slide on now that I've completely confused everybody. You can put the next slide on, which is the PCF, the Professional Capabilities Framework, which was introduced in 2012, but has made it very specific that values and ethics are fundamental to social work practice, social work capabilities, and how our capabilities are measured. Values and ethics are there. It's not just ethics. There's a separation between values and ethics. So there's an understanding that they are different things, different concepts, but yet the code of ethics doesn't help you to see that. So I guess what I'm doing in this session is helping you to think about questions you might want to ask in your placements or when you go back to university. Can we look at these again? What does it mean to actually understand what values are, what principles are, what is a standard and a rule, how do they inform values or ethics? And it's good to revisit them because you can see they're then in the PCF with critical reflection and analysis. So both those things are judged as being important to social work practice. And what I've put in here, and so anybody from Wales, Northern Ireland or Scotland, please forgive me because all I have included here is the knowledge and skills statements for practitioners in adult services and child and family social work in England, just to show how very little mention is made of ethics in those statements. And this is it, this is a sum total of it. You have the professional ethics and leadership statement, which just talks about social workers being able to demonstrate the principles of social work. Okay, so do we remember what principles are? Essential norms in a system of thought or belief? Right, so is that easy to do? Is that easy to unpack when you're on a home visit? How do you know that you're acting in a principled way? Same for children and families, child and family social work is demonstrating principles. It says a little bit more about attitudes and beliefs. So again, those words are coming up frequently. Ethics, principles, attitudes, beliefs. So they're all related. And the last one just is very specific to the law and family and youth justice systems. And I just included the newly qualified social worker level on here in relation to values and ethics from the PCF. So again, it's about applying ethical principles and values. But in order to apply the principles and values, you need to know what you mean by principles and values. Hence, going back to the definitions, going back to configuring with your practice educators, with your social work managers, with your lecturers, what does it mean to have ethical principles? What are principles and values in social work, and how they connect with the code of ethics and how those things then relate to practice? So I've just thrown this question in again after that really, really fast whistle stop through the BASWA code of ethics definitions. Do you feel like when you get to this stage, you actually could say, oh yeah, I know what ethics are from reading those documents? I mean, you might do, but if you're like me, then you'll say, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the definitions were clear enough for me. So I see somebody saying, no, which is, yeah. And if it's helpful at all, I've been studying this for a long time and I still get really confused, and I still have to remind myself what are the differences between each of those concepts. So I've decided to break it down and try and make it a little bit easier, perhaps. If some of you are experts in ethics already, then please forgive me, but I've just made this much simpler. Ethics, a system of moral principles. And now I've probably fallen into my own trap there, and I've just used another definition to define something. So that's a lesson for me, having looked at this now with fresh eyes. That's maybe not so helpful, but yeah, ethics help people make decisions about how they lead their lives. So again, it's about what's good for individuals, what's good for society. And from a philosophical point of view, it can be described as a moral philosophy, and comes from the Greek word ethos, which is about customs, habits, characters, or dispositions. Now, I always think of that word referring more specifically to virtue. So I think it's really interesting to already see that there is a link between virtue and ethics, being about customs and habits and practice, and being familiar with doing something, behaving in a particular way because of practicing it, doing it often enough so it becomes part of how you practice. So to be an ethical practitioner, you have to keep trying to be an ethical practitioner. You can't just do it on Mondays and Thursdays, and the rest of the days you're going to do something else. It's got to be consistent. Thanks, Siobhan. Ethics. So ethics are externally and socially constructed rules or regulations. So what that says is that they are determined, and here's your question, Dave, determined by culture, religions, philosophies, professions, institutions. They're kind of imposed upon us as individuals in society. Could be your community, could be the street you live on, or the block of flats that you live in could have a particular ethical code for how you're expected to behave in a good way, a right way in that building. So they're external to us, they come to us. They're imposed on us from outside. It's probably an easy way of thinking about them. They're often defined as morals and actions, because morals are about the ideas and the beliefs. So no, try not to use the definitions to define it. The morals are about how we think and feel and respond to things, but the ethics give us the rules and the standards in order to be able to do something in a good or a right way. Does that make sense? If I'm rabbiting, please just shout at the screen, just say, no, this doesn't make sense. Ethics are the framework that tell us what to do, or help us to understand what might be the right thing to do. They can't tell us what to do, because that would be prescriptive social work, and none of us really want to do that. We want to be able to make decisions based on the context that we're in, the circumstances that are presenting themselves to us, and to be able to treat each individual person that uses our service as an individual and not just apply a universal ethics. Has this happened? Do they have this wrong with them? Are they having this problem? You know, we're trying really hard to not be in a tick box culture. So ethics are not prescriptive, but they provide a framework and a guide for us to be able to find a way through dilemmas and find out what's the best thing to do to help people to have good lives, right to the very beginning, right to the definitions about achieving human rights, social justice, by doing the right thing with people and for people. They don't always give us the right answers, but they do help us to ask other questions in order to start to find answers that might fit. Because in ethics, they're not always, it's not black and white. It's not polarized, and they're not binaries of absolute right and absolute wrong, rarely. Sometimes there might be, so some people might believe that there are absolutes, but I think there are as many different views about what's right in the world as what's wrong. We wouldn't have to look far beyond politics in the UK to come up with some ideas about how very differently people think about what's right and what's wrong and what's good conduct in a public office. So ethics help us to think about things outside of ourselves. Morals refer to ourselves. They're internal, and there's a definition coming up, but morals are internal. There are our own ideas and views and feelings that sculpted in a way through all of our experiences through life, from our childhood, the community we live in. You know, there are ideas about what's right or wrong, whereas ethics come from outside. So we can have a huge disconnect between ethics and morals, and that can create huge tension for people at work, sometimes in social work practice in particular, because we're often faced with very meaty challenges. You have a 13-year-old girl who's pregnant. How many ethical dilemmas sit in there? Do you support that young person to have an abortion? Do you blame her for having underage sex? What's the role of the person who got that young person pregnant? Was it the result of an assault? Was it a consensual relationship? What are all the ethical dilemmas that go with working with that young person? We don't have to go very far to think about how that might not connect ethically with our moral base, because we might have very firm beliefs about what should happen or should not happen in that situation. But often our organizational ethics will set the scene for us, and we have to work with that or find a way to negotiate that with our managers. So ethics and morality are related, but they're not codependent. They can exist separately and have quite happy lives. I can be this kind of moral person in my home life. I'm sure some of you probably heard it. Well, yes, I can 9 to 5, I can be like this. And then when I go home, I have my own life. I don't know if any of you have heard that yet, but I'm sure you probably have heard it, Siobhan. I've often heard people say, I can be thinking this way at work, but as soon as I walk out the door, I can hate homosexuals, I can dislike people of a different culture, but in the workplace I have to work with them. And for me that's a huge disconnect, but unless you're unpacking those ideas, you might not even be aware of them, which again is how we then think back to how critical reflection helps us. But we can move on to the next slide, Sean. Sorry, I've just really gone at it, hammer and tongs there, sorry. And this is, again, it goes back to your question, Dave, where do ethics come from? Some people assume that they're always about God and religion, that you only have ethics if you're a religious person or spiritual. Human conscience, intuition, you know, moral cost-benefit analysis. We do something because it's going to benefit more or less members of our community. We follow other people's examples, or we just intuitively have a desire for helping other people to achieve the best. Or I like this one, the idea that ethics comes from political power. And I think this one's, again, really important, thinking about critical reflection. So I think the next slide, Siobhan, talks about that. Sorry, oh no, it doesn't. It goes a little bit further on, we'll talk about that. But just again, to go back to morals, they're personally held views about what's good, right, or proper. Again, we've got beliefs coming in, beliefs about obligations. So what you have to do or don't do. So I don't have to vote. I don't have to wear a mask. I don't have to behave in a particular way on my street. And it's very rooted in childhood experiences, so it becomes part of who we are longer term. So they're often used interchangeably, because ultimately they're about helping us to do what's good and right in society for other people and for ourselves. Then it's not always easy to make the distinction between what's an ethical code and what's a moral code. And unless you sit and actually try and work it out, you probably can't do it on the wing, because it's not always that clear cut. But it's good just to sit and think that I don't know, is that an ethical value or an ethical principle, or is that my moral beliefs that are coming into play here? Again, we'll move on from there. It's just, again, something to bear in mind, just to keep checking in with yourself. What morals am I drawing on here? What ethics do I think I'm using here? And this is the slide I was thinking about ethics and power. Some people think that ethics is the codification of political power. I think that's what it says, isn't it? Political ideologies. And the function of ethics is to state, enforce, and preserve particular political beliefs. And again, going back to the example of Nazi Germany, I think people would definitely say that that was a power structure enforcing a set of ethics upon the population. So by repeating messages, by repeating the rules that you give to people, telling them what they can or can't do, you create an ethical structure, you create an ethical system, and then people assume that those beliefs are theirs, that they've always had these ideas. These ideas have always existed. Sometimes it's really important to step out of a broader structural ethical position and think about how you fit with that, or even how you fit with your own social work teams, how they fit in your national context or your community context. Are there disconnects there? Not everything matches up neatly and tightly. And this is why I say that critical reflection links really nicely with ethics, because critical reflection, the critical is about power and thinking about power, how power is operationalized and how it is created, and how it affects people, how it affects us, how it affects our service users. So if we think that ethics possibly comes from a power base, then if we're using critical reflection in the way that should be and thinking about power, then we are already in an ethical position as well. So critical reflection makes us ethical, or helps us to be ethical. That makes sense. So just thinking in terms of how we practice in our offices, there are different approaches to ethics, and there are even more than this. Some people think about what it means to be moral and how to be ethical. Normative ethics is about moral judgments and how we actually enact them, what we do. Applied ethics is also about practice, but much more broadly thinking about war, capital punishment. And what we have in the next slide is the idea that in social work, we tend to use normative ethics, because normative ethics and normative ethical theories are about standards, values, that critique current arrangements, which again is critical reflection, isn't it? Having a look at power, how that influences how people live their lives in the context that they're in. Are people choosing to have to use food banks, or is that the consequence of austerity measures and COVID restrictions, etc., etc.? So the normative ethics help us to think about what standards help us to critique those ideas and work with them. So again, it's about standards, norms of behavior for living a moral life, which is an individual thing, but actually as social workers, we're trying to practice in an ethical way. So normative ethics help us to find and work with the standards and norms of an ethical social worker. And so that's about our actions within our institutions. Okay, so there are so many other ways of thinking about ethics, and this pictogram helps you think about some of those. So, I mean, if anybody wants these slides, I'm quite happy to send them all out afterwards, so you can pursue these at your peruse these at your leisure, and just think about the differences between some of the ethical positions. But generally, in the next slide, in social work practice, we tend to be normative. So we're thinking about what makes us moral practitioners, what makes us ethical practitioners. And we tend to use three models: the consequentialism, deontological model, or the Aristotelian or the virtue approach. So you can go to the next slide, please. Told you this was a whistle-stop tour of confusion. So yeah, next slide, please, Sean. Consequentialism. You've probably all heard the story. If you were on a runaway train and you could save 5 people or 1 person, what's the ethical thing to do? And consequentialism basically says you choose the action that's going to be of benefit to the most people. So you would probably switch the track so that the train actually kills 1 person instead of 5. That's consequentialism. It's about the outcome, it's about the result. So often in social work practice, it's about resources and allocation of resources. So maximizing the good for the most people. So it might mean that some people don't get very good service, but lots of people get a service of some kind. Is that ethical, or is it better to do something else? That's the dilemma for you to think through. Next slide, please. Deontological ethics are about duties, obligations, rules. So if you love tick box social work, you probably quite like a deontological approach, because that's about doing the right thing, regardless of what the consequence is, but you do the thing that's required of you. So if policy says you do not work past 5 o'clock, and a child comes into your office at 10 to 5 and needs to be placed, but you say, no, sorry, my handbook says I can't work past 5, then you're actually following a code of ethics that says you are doing the right thing according to your policies in one respect, but then you might be actually not following a policy in another respect. So it can become a dilemma, but it's ultimately about doing the right action. It's about the action itself being right, not about the consequence and how many people benefit. Whereas virtue ethics is neither about the actions themselves or about the consequences, but it's about the individual who's being ethical. So virtues are character traits, disposition, habits. And if you can remember where we saw those words before, we heard them used in the description of ethics. So ethics being about disposition, character traits, qualities, ways of being. So there's a real fit there, that to be virtuous, you're likely to be ethical. So virtue ethics is about the good character of social workers. So it's how we are as social workers in practice. We probably like to think that if we were to draw up a list of social work virtues, we'd probably come up with compassion, empathy, kindness, generosity. I don't know if anybody wants to throw some into the comments, please feel free to do so, what you think makes a virtuous social worker. But again, the key here is about practice. You know, the emphasis on developing habits through practicing them, that you have to continue to be kind in order to become a kind person. You can't just be kind on Sundays and expect that to filter through the rest of the week. No, you have to do it again and again. And in social work, we're often tested. Our virtues are tested quite a lot, aren't they? Like, how do we conduct our social work practice in a virtuous way? And there's just a really quick summary of some of the pros and cons of any of those three approaches of ethical practice. But we can see that we draw on all of them in our practice every day. But I'm really driven, as somebody who loves critical reflection, I'm really pulled towards virtue ethics, because I think virtue ethics, talking as it does about how we are as individuals, I think that critical reflection, if we practice that in a way that means it's not something that we have to forcefully drag along to supervision with us or bring into team meetings, but that we learn how to do it in a more everyday practice. So we think in a more critically reflective way, that it becomes part of who we are as social workers, then it could be considered a virtue, because what it does is help us to think about how the people we work with and how we as professionals and how as other professionals we work with achieve human flourishing, which is kind of, if we look at going back to the beginning, when we think about what it means to be a social worker, social workers aim to help everybody achieve human flourishing. So to have well-being and a good quality of life, or the best quality of life they can have to fulfill their potential. And we do that by following the values of social justice and human rights and all the other principles that inform those. But again, I don't think we've necessarily covered what it means to think about beliefs and opinions. So I think I've got some definitions for you that might help move on down. But do you have any better of an idea now than when we read the Basel Code of Ethics? Or are you even more confused now? Has this clarified anything, or just thrown up even more dilemmas about how to understand ethics in social work? And if it's creating
Oh, Anne-Marie, sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's making it more confused, if I'm honest. And a couple of people have said that in the chat. And I think that's the point you're making, perhaps. But I'm like, I mean, it's blowing my mind. I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so much going on here. It's just like really so many different things, aren't there, involved?
Which I apologize for doing that, because I just thought instead of answering any dilemmas, I'm actually going to create some, because I think in order to, we can very easily say, yeah, I know what it means to be, I've done the ethics module, I know it, but actually there's so much more sitting beneath it. So I just thought, well, what else is ethics? It's all of these other things, all these other words have meaning and significance for how we think about ethics. Attitudes, and we'll probably say to young people, don't give me that attitude. Or, oh, I went to visit a family today and they were full of attitude. Or don't make assumptions. We're told this when we're doing our analysis, our assessments, you know, be wary of assumptions. But what are assumptions exactly? And how do these things connect? So when I was thinking about it, I was trying to be all pretty and I was trying to do it with stars, but it wasn't actually working. But I thought it was actually worked as a slide just to say, look at all these things that also go with ethics. If you want to think about ethics, you've got to have a sense of what all those other things mean as well, because ethics just isn't just a word that stands on its own. So if you go to the next slide, again, it's just, I'm listing those words and saying, do you see that those words have different meanings, or are you able to make distinctions between them? And maybe what this is just setting homework for all of you to go away and actually think, how do I understand that word? And how do I connect it to the words on either side of it, or to all of them? Do I see a connection? And on the next slide, I've actually given you some really short definitions of those words. So again, like I said, it's homework to go away and think about. Siobhan, if you can do the next slide, please. Again, as I've already said, principles offer you your baseline, your fundamental truths, laws, tenets, doctrines. They're the things that inform everything else. There's a universality to them. They tend not to change. Sorry, we'll just go back to that slide, Siobhan, sorry, very quickly. The previous slide. So the one after that, sorry.
Sorry, I think, Anne-Marie, there might be a slight delay at what you're getting. But
okay, it's fine. This is the one
I think I've got the right slide up.
Yeah, this is here, yeah. So beliefs. Really quick way of remembering this. Beliefs are what we hold to be true. So I can believe that I'm Spider-Man. It's my belief. You cannot challenge it. It's my belief. Doesn't matter whether it has any truth or is based in reality. It doesn't have to be evidence-based at all. It's my belief. An opinion is a view or a judgment about something. Again, it doesn't have to be evidence-based. It's mine. My opinion. It's what I think. An assumption is the sum of values, beliefs, and all of those values and beliefs, and opinions. They all kind of feed into your assumptions. But assumptions are learned over a long period of time. They're the beliefs that we've picked up as toddlers, in school, in nursery, in church, in our communities. And I tend to think of it, if you're like, your beliefs tend to sit here somewhere, and your values, like your values and your beliefs sit here, but your assumptions sit at the back of your head. They become so much a part of who you are that you just drag them out. The kind of learned responses to ideas and things that you experience, they're like really deep rooted in you. Attitudes are the behaviors that then go with those beliefs and opinions and assumptions. So it's how you respond to things, what you think and what you do as a consequence of these beliefs and opinions. And we've already had definitions of values, but values is about what's important, beliefs about what's taken to be true. And the ethics, again, I think this is quite a nice way of thinking about it. Ethics, what kind of person should I be? Not necessarily what should I do? That's quite a nice question to think about. Anyway, so we can move quickly on. Again, like I said, there's a load of definitions, loads of words in this session. Probably going to make some of you pull your hair out, but hopefully I'll send you, if you want the slides, I can send them all to you and you can think about them in more depth. So we've already defined virtue, again, as being like ethics, as an acquired quality. So it's something that's practiced through habit. You don't just pick up courage or kindness because you fancy being courageous one day. I mean, to actually be genuinely and fully virtuous, you have to do it a lot, repeatedly. And human flourishing is about helping all of us to achieve the best that we can and to have the best lives that we can, and the world and the plants and the animals and the mountains and everything. And this is how I think that ethics links with critical reflection, as well as connecting with power, which we think about if we're thinking of the critical component of reflection. But if critical reflection is about the conscious examination of, or learning from, or making meaning from experience, then it's really important for us that when we're doing it, we unpack our hidden values, assumptions, and beliefs that we think are just, we might wheel them out in a critical reflection exercise, but not realize how they actually are tracking our ethical position as well. It's like this dual process going on. But the critical reflection process or experience helps us to link much more with our own sense of who we are and our values and beliefs and assumptions, and link them with our sense of self as an individual and as a social worker, and examine our practice in our local context, our immediate context, but also examine it in the wider context, politically, socially, culturally. So it allows us to take on board a whole range of perspectives and to not be fixated on having a single objective truth as the answer to everything. The idea that ethics doesn't answer every question helps us to think about holding multiple perspectives. And often we'll find that when we're assessing a family situation or an individual situation, they might have a very different idea about what's good parenting or what's adequate to being able to give consent than we might have from our professional position. So I was mapping out, I was trying to map out how all these concepts are linked to each other, and I realized that I put principles at the top and I didn't actually arrow into values, and I don't know why I didn't do that, but there should be an arrow there. I can actually change it on the next set of slides. But you can see how all these ideas feed into each other, and that they are connected. They're not separate entities. When we talk about reflection, whether that's critical reflection or any of the other reflective processes, we do talk about where our values and beliefs and assumptions inform those things, and whether we can now introduce ethics and morals and think about how each of those processes, or being ethical or being a critically reflective practitioner, help us to contribute to human flourishing. That might be a really interesting question or a really interesting exercise to do in your workplace. How is what I'm doing today contributing to my human flourishing, the human flourishing of my colleagues, the human flourishing of the service user, of the community? You're just broadening it out. So yeah, just pictogram to think how things might link up. If anybody wants to ask any questions on that, or send me any questions to think about how things are connected, or any questions about anything that I've witted on about, I'm really happy to answer them. My Twitter and email is there. So what else have we got left? We've got a few slides. I know I'm kind of running out of time rapidly, or I've run out of time, haven't I? What uses ethics? Ethics help us to find answers. They give us tools for thinking about difficult issues, thorny issues. And if they are to be useful, they have to affect how we behave as practitioners, and how, in a way, how we might then influence the behavior of the people that we work with. Right, so very quickly, I have attached to this presentation some very, what's the next slide, Siobhan? I can't see, it's, what have I got? Yeah, I've just, again, I can send these out because I know we've run out of time, but I've put together some slides with some answers, some questions that might be useful to ask yourself in your practice, thinking about who will be affected by my decision, who is most immediately impacted, who might have a strong opinion about my decision, but lacks the power, the money, or social status to be heard, who's affected in the short or the long term. They're all ethical questions that we can ask each other. And I've actually just attached like 4 slides worth of questions to think about. Like, what's my ethical position? Do I think I'm taking a deontological position here, or a consequentialist position, or I'm actually operating from a virtue position. Yeah, so you probably can just whiz through those slides and just say they are available to people, like they can have them for afterwards, because it's a useful exercise to think about when you're writing your assessments or when you're making a decision. How is this an ethical piece of work? And some of those questions might help you to answer that question itself. Can go on to the last slide if you like, Siobhan, which is just me saying that social work attempts to answer the big questions in life about how we live, how we contribute to the well-being of other people, how we contribute to the well-being of the planet, and create conditions for excellence for all of us, that we all have the best that we can have. And critical reflection supports social workers to develop a really deep consciousness about their own morals and ethics. Because if you're having to sit in a session, make yourself vulnerable, think about your own deeply held beliefs and values that you might not even have brought consciously forth, because it's quite easy to stay surface in social important, because it helps us to unpack some of those feelings that we either pretend aren't there or we haven't realized are there, and that can impact on our practice. But also it helps us to contribute to greater social good, greater good for everybody. And I'm going to warble this really quickly. Ethics and critical reflection are really linked, because they draw on some of the same concepts, same terms, they're used slightly differently, they inform each other differently. But if we try and think of them all as being connected, then we won't ever just assume that. As an ethical social worker, I don't actually need to use critical reflection, because it's just a newfangled thing that was brought in for the PCF, and it's not really that important. But they are both, they work alongside each other. And that's, having run over time, I'll stop there because I know I need to stop, but there's so much more I could say. I know I was getting faster and faster, but I hope that's given everybody food for thought in a really useful way and hasn't created too much challenge.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. Thank you for that. There was so much within it, obviously, so many different things within it, and we're seeing people in the chat now saying it's been brilliant. Thank you. I think what people have said is it's helped clarify some things, and then other things it's actually made more confusing. And I think that's one of the things about ethics, isn't it? And one of the things that you've said, and what I've been thinking about when I've been listening to you is, you know, I do a lot of work on trying to clarify the difference between a theory, a model, a method, and an approach, or trying to clarify the difference between reflection, critical reflection, and reflexivity, because they're the things that I'm really interested in, theory and reflection. But what it's really made me think about when I've been listening to you is that it's making us, it's about how do we separate out what is a theory, what is a you know, a value, an ethic, a principle, a standard, a belief. How do we do that in a much, much clearer way? Because I think one of the things we're really not very good at in social work is we lump loads of stuff together under one umbrella, and that can make it very difficult for us. You know, I'm not an expert in this area at all, and it took me back to being terrified at university, thinking I don't understand any of this. 32 years ago, it took me back into that sort of classroom thing of feeling really quite frightened by it. So, and I'm not an expert in it at all, but I know when we don't understand what something is, we don't know how to use it. I do know that. I know that from, if we don't know what a theory is, we don't know how to use it. So I think it's really important that we understand what these things are so that we can use it. And I think you've given us some really good food for thought there. And the other thing, I've written down a couple of pages of notes here, but the other thing that I've written down links to something that a manager said to me in a session this week. And the manager said something along the lines of, I just want someone who can do the do. And as they were talking about that, it made me think about what you were saying about, you know, ethics are about not what we do, but it's about how should I be? And I think one of the things about really busy working environments at the moment is we don't always have time to think about how should I be. and there is too much doing the do, and we need to be able to think. And I know, Sarah Banks has talked about needing to slow down ethics with the pandemic, and I think that whole idea of slower ethics becomes very important. So I think this is really important. We know that people are saying they really want us to send out the slides. We are not able to do that. We as a team, yeah, as a team, we're volunteers. We do this the team do it at weekends. It is impossible for us to send out slides. We've said it every week, and we're on week 62, and still people will ask us for slides. We're not able to do that. We did tell Anne-Marie we weren't able to do that, but Anne-Marie has said you can email her for the slides. So we've put Anne-Marie's contact details into the chat, and if Anne-Marie can send those to you, that would be fabulous and very kind of you, Anne-Marie.
Well, I'm really happy.
Sorry, Anne-Marie.
If anybody wants to ask me for the slides or wants to clarify anything, ask any questions, I'm really happy to have any conversations about it people want to have. So, because I'm conscious that it's a really full session and there's a lot of information, and my head would be blown. So, yeah.
And that was, that's very, very kind of you. So thank you very much for making that offer. We know that as we get to the end of sessions, people like to know what's coming up next. And next week, we're going right back to basics. We know our basic webinars are very popular with people. So we're going to go right back to basics and look at how can we build confidence with reflective practice. We're also going to be introducing you to some new team members next week, and it's going to be a team-led session. We're then looking at a session called Social Work Post-COVID, and we've got that with Farah Khan and Sharon Davidson, who are the two leads for the Principal Social Worker Network for Children's in England. And I think that's really fascinating, because when we were talking about that months ago, they titled it Social Work Post-COVID. Well, we're still right in the midst of COVID, aren't we? So it's not going to be post-COVID, but I think it'll be a fascinating topic webinar. Then we're talking about friendship and the importance of friendship in social work, which I think again is going to be a wonderful session. And then we're looking at anti-oppressive practice and ending our season on an A to Z. We know how much people love our A to Zs, so that's what we're going to be doing. And then we're taking a short break, and we'll be back with our season 4. So and we're just in the midst of planning that at the moment. We've got some fabulous sessions put together for season 4. So if you want to register for next week, I'm sure that the team have already put the link into the chat, but you know the usual means: email us and you'll get the automated link, or watch our social media. But we hopefully will see you next week for our Back to Basics, building confidence in reflective practice. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for leading us through that really complex topic tonight, but really making us all think. I think that's what you've really done, is you've really made us all think. And that's what reflection does. Reflection always gives more questions than answers. And that's a good reflection, when it gives you more questions than answers.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Anne-Marie. And good night to everybody. Thanks, everyone.